Maintenant, for chat 3 language, voulez-vous savoir comment je l'ai fait? Watch this video. If you want to learn a second language and you're struggling to do so, don't feel too disheartened because I've been there myself. I would say that I fluently speak 3 languages: French, Jamaican Creole, and English. However, in my language learning journey, I also did start learning German as well. In this video, we will explore all methods that I've done in order to advance my level in all of these languages, as well as the mistakes that I have done as well, so you don't have to make them yourself. I'm Grisel. I'm a linguistic specialist and English educator at Unbounded Education. And if you like videos about this, be sure to subscribe and give us a like, as we have lots of upcoming videos about language learning. So let's start learning. Moi, I start with Patois. Jamaican Creole, also known as Patois, is the national language of Jamaica. Even though it is not the official language of the country, it is the native language of most Jamaicans, with about 3.2 million speakers. There is some controversy regarding how it's viewed by people that we could dive into in another video, but here's a little background about me. I was born in Jamaica, but I immigrated to the United States when I was 6 months old, and I returned back to Jamaica when I was 3, where I began talking. While I had some exposure to English, the language that I was primarily surrounded by at this time was Patois, as both sides of my family are Jamaican and I was pretty much surrounded by Jamaicans. When I started speaking, it was in Patois and I started my schooling in Jamaica. After returning back to the United States, I was still exposed to Patois through my parents. However, the longer I stayed in the United States, the more Americanized I got. Retaining everything that I learned when I was a child was getting more and more difficult because in school I was speaking English, all my friends spoke English, and I only really spoke Patois in family conversations. So around the age 10 or 11, when I returned back to Jamaica, I noticed that I was having a bit of difficulty actually speaking Patois and actually comprehending it. So that's when I thought to myself, I actually have to continue practicing in order to be able to speak fluently or actually just retain everything. So that's when I started to use it more with my family and started consuming more Jamaican media. Nowadays, I primarily only speak Patois with my family, but I do mix in English here and there. And nowadays, Jamaicans even think that I'm fresh out of Jamaica when they hear me speak Patois. Okay, but how is this important? Well, we can draw lessons from this experience. As a baby, I essentially just picked up the language because I was surrounded by it. Babies learn languages through trial and error. They're not afraid to make mistakes like adults. Even when infants are very young and they lack the physical capabilities to produce speech sounds in their throat, they imitate adults and try to replicate speech patterns.
Yeah, your turn.
Are you happy? Yeah.
This can be applied to your own language learning journey. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. It's a normal part of the process. What's crucial in your language learning journey, however, is correcting those mistakes. Another takeaway we could take from this is how demoralizing it was for me to notice that I was losing my ability to speak Patois. This happens to many language learners. Suddenly losing competency in your language can be very disheartening. For example, if I live in New Zealand and I'm from Morocco, it's normal for me to lose my ability to speak Arabic. However, this can be reversed relatively easily, as Arabic would have been my first language. Your brain tends to keep information in your subconscious, and you need something to elicit it. Just as I did with Jamaican Creole, you would have to try to force yourself to only utilize that language and not default to the majority language. So try to be exposed to the target language as much as possible. Try to converse with your family, try to consume as much media, and try to think in it as well. You could really condense this method as something called language maintenance. It's pretty common for people to learn a language, and after they reach a certain level, they just pretty much stop doing anything. You could think of a language as a house. Houses are built and constructed. However, over time, they essentially fall apart. They get worn down by the elements and potentially any other things that can happen to the house. Therefore, in order to prevent the house from collapsing and falling apart, we would have to maintain it. That is the same concept with language. If you don't use it, you lose it. Therefore, language maintenance is very important because if you don't continue to maintain the use of the language, then you're essentially just going to forget everything that you once learned. Here are some tips and tricks that I used in order to retain my fluency in Patois. So one of the things that I would suggest for you to do in order to do language maintenance is to consume some sort of media. This could be TV shows, films, radio stations, podcasts, etc. It just has to be something that enables you to utilize the language. In addition, try to make it as regular practice as well. I had a little bit of a cheat code because my family, I literally lived with them. However, not everyone has that luxury. So if it's not your native language or a language that you have relatively easy access to, you could use apps such as Tandem and Hello Talk, which are apps that enable you to get in contact with native speakers of the language. Lastly, I would suggest for you to think in the language. A lot of people don't notice this, but you really think in a language. So try to utilize the target language in your thoughts. While overcoming this hurdle, I myself was primarily only thinking in English. But nowadays, I would say I think mostly in Patois when I'm alone. But the language that I think in when I'm surrounded by other people really depends on the context. If I'm surrounded by English speakers, I'll think in English. If I'm surrounded by French speakers, I'll think in French. Next is English. English is the lingua franca of the world and the language that I was primarily exposed to my entire life. In Jamaica, I also was surrounded by the language to a certain degree as it is the official language of the country. However, as you could tell, I do not have a Jamaican accent when I speak English, and that is because I spent most of my life in the United States. Therefore, I was primarily exposed to the American accent of English. Similarly to Patois, there's not much I could really say about English because I would consider it my first language as well. Patois and English are really my first languages because I really was just surrounded by the languages and just picked them up. Especially with English, it was pretty much inescapable. I do remember when I first returned back to the United States from Jamaica, I would say certain words differently because I only knew them in Patois. For example, I would say pangana instead of pomegranate. Nevertheless, I was able to seamlessly transition into the American accent of English and pretty much learn it well. So what can we take away from this? Well, we can take away immersion. The way I was able to learn English, specifically the American dialect of English and accent, was through immersion. Obviously, you don't have to move to whatever country where the language is spoken to learn effectively. However, you must immerse yourself in all aspects of your life in order to learn a language very quickly. So yes, if possible, you can move to the country to immerse yourself faster than normal. However, you can do this without stepping one foot in the country. I would like to get more in depth with this in our next language. La langue prochaine est le français, ma troisième langue. My relationship with French is very long, as it was the first language that I sought out to learn myself. To start, when I was in 7th or 8th grade, I just randomly decided to learn the language. Therefore, when I started high school, I took my first ever French class in 9th grade. I became obsessed with the language, and during my free time, I would just pretty much look at grammar books in order to understand the structure and how the language works. I was able to progress quickly for someone whose main introduction to the language was through a high school class. What really helped me was looking at the most commonly used words in French. If you are just starting to learn your foreign language, I would suggest for you to try looking up the 100 most commonly used nouns and verbs. Maybe try extending this to the 1,000 most used words in the language as well once you reach a higher level. This will enable you to get a solid base in the language and accelerate your language learning. I finished high school at about 16, and in college, I continued learning French. However, I noticed a glaring weakness of what I was doing. I pretty much understood how French worked and its grammar, but I didn't really do any listening. So I could read and write simple texts, but understanding spoken French was very difficult for me. And the reason behind this was because I neglected other areas of the language. I focused on the grammar aspect, but I did not invest as much time in the oral and listening aspects of the language. Because my goal in French was to be as fluent as a native, this was very difficult for me. So here's my first lesson. A lot of people may focus on a certain aspect of a language because they find the other aspects to be a little bit too difficult, but try to divide your time into all elements of the language. So yes, you can look at grammar, but don't only focus on grammar. Focus on listening, focus on speaking, writing, and grammar as well. If you notice that you're a little weak on a certain area, then you can focus on that area. For example, if you're struggling with writing or speaking, try focusing on those areas. For me personally, at the time, I didn't know that was the problem. So I thought I was just failing at French. So that's when I decided to take a drastic decision. For university, I wanted to move to a French-speaking country. However, I wanted to be somewhere where I could still speak English because I wanted to go to university. And on the other hand, I did want to learn French. So I thought of Canada. But wait, you may be thinking, why Canada? Well, Canada does have English as an official language, but French is an official language of Canada as well. And I decided to move to Quebec, the only primarily French-speaking province in the country. And I went to Montreal, the largest city in the region and the second largest city in the country. However, Montreal is very different from the rest of Canada and even Quebec because it is a melting pot of languages. What made Montreal perfect for me was the large English-speaking minority, as about 13% of Montrealers are actually native English speakers. And there are even certain areas of the city where that English speaking minority is the majority. As you can see on this map, Montreal is segregated in regards to what language is primarily spoken. Red indicates that English is the majority language of families. Blue indicates French, and green indicates any language that is neither of the two. Now you may be going, why is this relevant? This is relevant because I moved to Montreal to be immersed in French. Well, it's not that easy. Because English is so integrated in Montreal's culture, actually 71% of the population here is bilingual in both English and French. Therefore, it's pretty easy to navigate the city with minimal French. All you would really have to learn how to do is just read signs that are in French. That, coupled with the fact that I went to an English-speaking university, made it a bit difficult to actually get my wish of being immersed in French. So then I pretty much noticed that my level of French was being stagnant. So that's when I decided to incorporate French in my life a bit more. The government provides French language courses, so I decided to register myself, as well as doing some French extracurricular courses at my university. In addition, I took French as a minor in order to be exposed to it a bit more. After gaining a higher understanding of the language, that's when I decided to get a job here. And I wanted a job where I could be in customer service so I could talk to as much people as possible. However, there is one mistake that I made. Remember that map of Montreal that I showed you? The city is very segregated in regards to what language is used in what area. The west of Montreal is primarily English speaking, and that's where I landed my job. So in the end, most of my clientele spoke English. About 70% of my clientele, I would say, were primarily English speaking, and the 30% were French speaking. So I ended up being in that same trap of being surrounded by English speakers. But don't get me wrong, I was able to advance in French because I did have the opportunity still to speak in French, as some of the clients didn't speak English and some of my colleagues were francophones or native French speakers. In addition, I was still participating in those French courses. However, I did notice that my advancement of French could have been a bit faster if I landed a job in the east of Montreal, for example, or even if I decided to move to a different city in Quebec. Nevertheless, being able to go to school and have a job did allow me to be able to converse in French and communicate. However, recently I began to revisit French because I do want to obtain a higher level of fluency in order to go to a French-speaking university for my master's degree. And I noticed that I'm missing vocabulary in specific areas. And this vocabulary is in more complicated and specialized domains. For example, in politics or biology. So how can this situation help you? So the lessons that I've gotten from this experience is that the best way to learn a language is to utilize it as much as possible. The more effort you put into learning the language, the more you will get out of it, and the faster you will learn. For example, if I had gotten a job in the east of Montreal, I most definitely would have had the level that I have now a bit faster. Actually, a lot faster. And after obtaining an intermediate level of the language, I pretty much just got lazy and was just like, if I could understand you and you could understand me, what's the problem? So I pretty much hit a roadblock where I was just the same level after reaching an upper intermediate level. So I never really advanced to the C1 very advanced level because I just got lazy, as I could pretty much work without any difficulty. I could converse and there would be no issues. But I did notice when I wanted to read more academic and more difficult material, I was pretty much struggling. So in order to do this, I would have to incorporate the language in more difficult subjects. So for example, if you're having difficulty to enter the B2 or C1 level, try incorporating the language for more complicated topics. Try listening to more specialized topics. For example, if you're in the medical field, try listening to podcasts with that language describing things in the medical field. In addition, you might even learn more complicated forms that could be used in the language as well. Furthermore, try reading texts about more complicated subjects, and this will enable you to obtain more vocabulary as well. A tutor and language partner can be helpful as well because they can instruct you of what path you can take. In addition, reading scientific journals and watching news can be very helpful as well. I'm not even going to try to say it in German because it's so bad. My relationship with German was rather short. However, I do plan on revisiting it in the future. When I was satisfied with my level in French, I decided to learn another language, and that language was German. I did the same approach with German that I did with French in order to accelerate my learning very quickly. I took a class and I tried to incorporate it into all aspects of my life. So in 6 weeks, I went from knowing nothing in German to having a lower intermediate level. How did I do this? I signed up for a self-paced German course that allowed me to learn vocabulary and grammar on my own time. In regards to speaking, I would speak to myself and speak to my best friend who's a native German speaker. In addition, I took an intensive 6-week German course. I excelled in this course, and my professor actually suggested that I take the intermediate version of the next course. Therefore, at my university, I took a placement test for German and I was placed in the intermediate level of the language. But I would honestly say that was my worst mistake. While taking the class, I was exposed to the worst ever language teacher I've ever had. So far, I pretty much only had positive experiences with the language and received much encouragement from everyone who I interacted with. However, this one person was able to demotivate me and really just made me give up on learning German. In class, I remember she called me out for this particular situation. And I don't really remember what exactly the topic was about, but her exact words were,
"This is so easy. Why can't you just get it right?"
I was not embarrassed. I was more so angry with how is this person able to be a language teacher and just be so disrespectful and rude. And the classroom environment was very, to put in simple words, just toxic. She would have a short temper with all of the students, and a lot of people ended up dropping the class. So on the same day of the incident, I actually just dropped the class because I had enough. And honestly, she was the primary reason of why I stopped learning German, because I was just unmotivated. So now I pretty much forgot 99% of everything that I learned in that short amount of time. However, this experience shows you that if you are demotivated and afraid that you will fail, you will fail. And you can even possibly lose out on everything that you have learned. However, I have made it a goal to relearn German in the future. Here are some things that I would do differently. I would focus more on self-studying rather than relying on teachers. I would try to listen to podcasts to be more acquainted with the language. I'm not telling you to not invest into tutors and teachers, but I would say see them more as guidance rather than being the spine of your language learning journey. In addition, if you ever find yourself in a classroom where you are unhappy and you feel like the environment is not welcoming to you, be sure to leave. Well, there you have it. That was my very long-winded language learning journey. The takeaways that you could get from this experience is the best way to learn a language is to be surrounded by it as much as possible. You do not necessarily have to move to the country. However, you could try to incorporate the language as much as possible in your life. This can be done through TV shows, podcasts, magazines, newspapers, interviews, etc. Try to think in the language, try to speak to someone, but don't only particularly focus on one aspect. Try to diversify the different methods. Also, try to make a language plan. This will enable you to have some structure to make sure that every aspect of the language is being touched on. In addition, do not allow yourself to get demotivated easily. Yes, there are going to be some periods of time where you are going to be frustrated, but don't ever give up. Because if you give up, then you might be able to just forget everything that you learned. And remember this, everyone learns at their own pace. Do not rush it. Lastly, if you want to have a very high level of the language, then you would have to do some more specialized learning and specific domains that you are interested in or that you want to work in. Thank you for watching until the end of this video. If you like videos like this, be sure to give us a like and subscribe to the channel. This has been Grisel, and don't forget to keep learning.